My exclusive guest today is the head of the Election Observation Mission of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, Owen Murphy. Thank you, Mr. Murphy, for coming to our studio. We already covered your preliminary assessment of Armenian parliamentary elections. After your preliminary assessment of the election process in Armenia, including pre-election campaign period and voting day, you gave a rather positive assessment and said that all candidates, I'm quoting you, could campaign freely throughout the process and voters were provided with a broad range of options. And you found actually limited number of cases violation, such as group voting, proxy voting, or attempts to influence voters. But also you found some shortcomings during the tabulation process, but as you said, it was rather insignificant. The vote count overall assessed positively. Now the opposition claims that there were massive violations of the vote and that there was a group voting by servicemen or army servicemen with alleged instruction to vote for the ruling party. So the opposition said it will contest the result in the Constitutional Court. It seems to me their findings are in stark contrast with your findings, with your assessment. What's your reaction to these allegations of?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. And rather than reacting to particular allegations made against ODIHR, I might just explain a bit about what we've done, because we've been here for 5 weeks now with our election observation mission. We've had long-term observers deployed to every region in the country. And for the election itself, on election day, we had more than 300 short-term observers. And what that allowed us to do was to visit more than half of the polling stations in the country. So we're confident in the assessment that we've made, and we're confident that it reflects what actually happened on election day. So in our preliminary statement, which we made after the election, we talked about the process itself being generally well managed, and we talked about what we observed on election day, giving it an overall positive assessment. We're still observing the elections, of course. We're still here in Yerevan, and we're going to remain to follow the complaints and procedures process, because that's a part of the election as well. And parties are, or at least one party is making a complaint and is going to take that complaint to the courts. That's their right, and we'll follow that process as well.
Interesting, but we have also the opposite claims. Even the local observers, some of them are pretty good ones and played really great role in previous elections. These are and they claim also that all these violations came voter bribing, or some cases of influencing the voting came from rather the opposition side. Do you observe any? You see any difference?
There have been many allegations of misconduct throughout the campaign period and on election day itself. We take any allegations that are brought to our attention incredibly seriously, and we review them. Yes. And our review of those allegations feeds into our preliminary statement and will feed into the final report that we'll make in a couple of months' time. But where there have been actual incidents reported to the authorities, that's what we're interested in, because again, we're observers. So it's for us to then observe how have these allegations being reported and how have the authorities followed up on them. And we know that, for example, the Prosecutor General is following up a number of cases in relation to alleged vote buying. We know that the Central Election Commission has had its own sessions in relation to complaints and abuse and is dealing with those. Those processes aren't finished, so we'll follow them. But to step back and take a broad look at what happened in the election in terms of the campaign period and election day itself, while there were incidents of things that you wouldn't like to see, that didn't impact the overall results. It didn't impact the overall running of the election campaign. And we do point to areas where we did see and observe difficulties ourselves, and they'll feed into recommendations for the future. Things around accessibility to polling stations, some incidents of interference in the procedures in the polling stations, question marks over the sufficient education of people working in polling stations. Those types of issues we've pointed to in our preliminary statement, and we'll be following up when we make recommendations.
There was one line in your assessment which says that, you know, the elections were administered well. What does it mean? Can you just a little bit translate that for our viewers? Is that the government performance, or what is it?
That's an assessment of the different authorities that are involved in running an election in the country. Mm-hmm. The most prominent authority and the most responsible authority would be the Central Election Commission. Mm-hmm. So part of our mandate when we are invited in by the authorities is to meet with each of the different agencies that have some role in the campaign. From the Central Election Commission, to the Prosecutor General, to the Ombudsman, to the Chairman of the Constitutional Court. So when we make that assessment about it being overall or generally well managed, it's a reflection on all those pieces, including the territorial election commissions and the precincts, the polling stations as well, because again, our teams have interacted at every level of the election. And while no election is perfect, when we look at the process that happened here, from registering candidates, looking at the voter lists, educating the people working in polling stations, trying to educate the voter about the new voting procedures, there was a shortened time frame because of it being an early parliamentary election and because of there being changes made only in April to the voting process. But notwithstanding those pressures, it was generally well administered. So each of those things that happen, so that on election day a person can actually go in and say who they want in government, that was well managed, and the bodies we interacted with were transparent and professional, and people were able to go and express their will through the ballot box.
Did you have a chance also to meet the proxies and also, you know, members of the local election commissions from the opposition side? Did you talk to them?
So part of my work as well was meeting with the political parties and their representatives.
Yes.
So I would have met candidates on the lists, and they would have had an opportunity then to voice their concerns about what might happen over the course of the campaign and on election day. And then, of course, I visited polling stations on election day, and I spoke to party proxies. Yes. I spoke to the chairpersons of the polling stations I visited, and that gives me a very hands-on interaction in terms of what's happening. But of course, you're not just relying on my impression. There are more than 300 experts in polling stations across the country doing the same work.
But were they focal in expressing their concerns if they saw any violations? I mean, what's your overall assessment of meeting with the opposing side that claim now the massive fraud and massive violations? Did you get that impression during your conversation on the voting day or not?
Well, for us, there's no opposing side. We're politically neutral.
I mean, I'm talking not opposing side, but the opposition alliances and parties.
Well, so we met with each of the parties, or we met with as many as we could, but we interacted with all of them.
Let's put it this way, non-ruling party, you know.
Okay, yeah. Well, as I said, we met with them. Yeah. They brought allegations to our attention and we reviewed them. And part of that review would have fed into our preliminary statement in terms of certain things that we touch upon. And we will continue our work looking through the complaints and appeals procedures before we make recommendations in our final report. So we take it very seriously, and we do talk about incidents, certain things that happened in certain polling stations that shouldn't have happened. But our general conclusion is that that did not impact the validity of the overall result. And it's worth repeating, we were in more than half of the polling stations in the country, so we have confidence in the sample that we've gathered.
And also, one of the leaders of opposition parties, former president, said when he was confronted with the fact that you gave positive assessment of these elections, he said, well, they also gave the positive assessment to, to elections that I was presiding as a president, but their conclusion was that it did not impact the final result. He's right. I mean, actually, observation missions that I've been covering, they came to Armenia, they registered a lot of violations, but at the end of the day, they said, this could not impact the final results. What qualitative difference between then and now? But opposition never accepted the results, of the previous elections. I'm talking about before revolution. What's your take on that?
I can only speak to this election because this is the election that I've been the head of mission for, and I can tell you that it was a competitive election. People could campaign freely. Candidates were able to go and organize events, and they organized events. But also the voters had choice in the number of parties running, and the voters were able to attend events if they wanted to attend events. And when it came to election day, people were able to go out and vote in a well-managed process where they could cast their vote, and that vote would be both respected and reflected in the overall results. So when you think about all the people that we had on election day in the polling stations, looking at the polling stations opened, looking at people voting, looking at the votes being counted and tabulated, we made a positive overall assessment of that. We found it to be transparent. And these are the conclusions that we've come to based on what we've seen in this election.
One particular allegation is about, the servicemen voting in a certain way, and then they were directed by their superiors, commanders, And now, what did you see? Have you been witnessing your observers? You said like 240 something, your own, ODIHR observers, and 70 something from Parliamentary Assembly of
Yeah, so
yeah.
Obviously on election day it was both
Yeah.
the ODIHR observers but also the parliamentarians from
exactly.
OSCE countries and Council of Europe countries. And we observed a number of individual incidents, but some of the bigger allegations that have been made, these are allegations that need to be proceeded through the official channels because again, we are observers. We observe, we make an assessment, and we have findings and conclusions and then recommendations. But where people feel legitimately that something went wrong, that's where the relevant procedures then have to come into effect. And that's why we're still here, to make sure that where people have a legitimate concern, that their concerns are being listened to.
Mr. Murphy, also the other question is, as you said, General Prosecutor and CEC registered some, and even the General Prosecutor, they brought some criminal cases against some, violations, which were pretty a strong one, big one. And how do you see any, overstepping of their, authorities in certain way, on behalf of the government? What do you see that all these cases were legally normal, no violation of?
Well, I mean, that's not a judgment for me to make. For me, it's to observe what we have seen, to report it with a degree of an assessment. It's really for the Armenian people to decide whether they think that certain people have overstepped the mark.
For example, the opposition claims that their proxies were persecuted, without any foundation, without any case. So have you seen something like that?
Well, on polling day, we didn't observe incidents in that manner. There are other things that have been alleged that, for example, are being investigated, like allegations around vote buying, which we know the Prosecutor General is opening at least 2 cases on, I think. So this is where we then follow and see what happens with those.
And also, we know that some lights went off during the tabulation, voter count. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we had reports again from our teams in the field about power outages in certain areas. It didn't have an impact on our overall observation.
No. Nothing. Okay. And now, as a very negative side of these elections, you highlighted very negative tone of the election campaign, and your observers reported increasingly high level of intolerant, inflammatory, and discriminatory rhetoric in the period of leading up to the election day. And to what extent it undermines the democratic nature of the elections? We see that this is becoming a trend in the countries with high level of democracy. These are voting democracies, but you see with the emergence of new tools to express yourself, I'm talking about social media, mushrooming everywhere, it becomes very easy for anyone to go and interfere with the campaign in a certain way, fake news, whatever. And this is becoming problematic not only in Armenia but also in the United States, in other countries. Why you are specifying, singling out this as a very negative trend?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's not just a problem in Armenia, but in Armenia also, it's not just a problem in social media. So when we looked at the campaign itself, we saw that it was, in fact, in some ways dominated by inflammatory rhetoric and personality-driven accusations and attacks, which only further kind of entrenched the polarization. And as a result of that type of campaigning, we've felt that it was difficult for voters to hear what the actual substantive messages were that were coming from the parties. You know, whether they wanted to be talking about investment in infrastructure or security issues, we felt that a lot of that was maybe kind of drowned out by the actual type of language that was being used. Now, in a political campaign in a democracy, candidates are free to go out and campaign that way if they want to, but at the same time, countries such as Armenia, who have signed up to the OSCE, have also signed up to respect each other in public discourse and also to call out intolerant language when they hear it. And that's a role for us in ODIHR as well.
Some people would criticize these elections that there was no substance in the debates, but I would disagree as a journalist, because I heard a lot of interesting point of views, and debates were really lively, and the issues were very broad, from starting from security to economy and social issues, education. And I believe that this was really very interesting campaign. Despite, if you don't consider the taking out this negative tone and animosity between all other aspects were pretty interesting as a journalist. I'm talking about.
No, of course. I mean, we try to give a general impression of what the kind of the campaign tone or atmosphere was like, the campaign environment. But it is true to say, depending both on what day of the election you were maybe tuning in, but also where in the country, because we saw different things in different parts of the country in terms of how active a particular party might be, or what they might be saying. It's the case that in one part of the country, a political party might be focusing on one part of their message, whereas in another part of the country, they're focusing on a different part of their message or a different style. So, I mean, we're not saying that there wasn't substantive discussion, that parties didn't have policy programs, but our general impression of the environment around the campaign was that they fell secondary, unfortunately, to the type of accusations that were being made and the name calling.
And for example, there were some 26 parties and alliances. Do you consider this positive or negative? What is it?
Well, we say it's unprecedented, I know, in the country, but it's competitive. There is choice there for the voters, and we do speak to that.
Do you see any artificial inflation of this number of parties, or
we didn't observe that.
Technical.
We didn't observe that. No, we didn't observe that. I mean, we have enough time to come in prior to, in the pre-campaign period, before parties and alliances are registered, to understand the political dynamic at play, to understand the political forces, and then when we see the new parties and alliances, we then have a chance for further interaction. And they were all positive and professional. And
also, how would you assess freedom of media in the country? There's difference between post-revolution elections and previous periods, when opposition almost did not have any resources, media resources. But you see now the opposition has more resources, even media resources, than the ruling party. What do you think about this?
Well, we spend a lot of time on media monitoring as part of our observations. We do a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of what's happening. And we just to let you know, we were monitoring 7 TV stations, I think 1 radio station, and 3 online platforms, including your own. And we've got a team of people doing that all the time to try and pick up on the actual debate and what's happening. I know from a general point of view that areas around freedom of the media have been improving over the last few years. There's more diversity in the media as well in terms of ownership. And we'd notice a change in how the politicians were being covered from the pre-campaign period to the campaign period. So in the campaign period, we did see people a number of outlets trying to cover the candidates, cover what was on offer to the voters, and reflect them, which are positive things. But we also, and we talk about it in our statement, there are concerns about the affiliation of some media outlets and how that might impact their coverage.
And how would you describe now Armenia's electoral procedure now? For example, when we say India is the election democracy, how you said electoral democracy, right? Can we call Armenia now electoral democracy, or not yet?
Well, I mean, what we saw on election day were voters going out and voting for the people they wanted to see in Parliament, and we had an outcome which has put 2 parties in parliament and a third now because of the electoral laws that are here. Some recounts are still ongoing as far as I'm aware. There still has to be an official declaration of the result. And when that happens, those parties then have a mandate and they enter parliament, and the governance of the country continues through a parliamentary democracy as it was before the election. So from that point of view, that is why we gave a positive overall assessment of what happened through the election process.
And what is the next step? What are you going
For
to?
us?
Yes. In 3 months, you will have the
Yes.
final.
So
result?
we're here still for probably another 10 days at least, and we'll continue to interact with the authorities where we have some follow-up questions on a
Will
technical
there be
matter.
any second interim report or something?
No. So we had an interim report which covered the period up until the end of May. We then had our preliminary statement of findings and conclusions the day after the result. And in 2 months' time, we'll present a final report which will include recommendations. And what we like to do then is come back and interact with the authorities as to those recommendations and what they mean and how they might be implemented. But ultimately, that's for the Armenian people.
Do you see the willingness on behalf of the government to implement your recommendations? Did you?
Well, so, I mean, I think, again, if you step out of the election for just a moment, this one election, there has been a process of electoral reform ongoing in the country. And we note that as well in our report, in our findings, the recent changes that were made in April, the changes that were made again in May that will come into force next year. And we point to other areas where there might be further changes as well. So, you know, the impression is there, obviously, if the May amendments are actually implemented next year, that these reforms continue. And, excuse me, from our interactions with the authorities here, they're looking forward to the final report. As I said earlier, no election is perfect in any country. And where there might be opportunities for improvements, I think they'll be taken on board.
And there were some predictions that some people were worried that after the elections, you know, there might be some sort of post-election violence, as it happens in some other countries. What's your assessment? You've seen that it's up to now is quiet.
Well, I mean, we were aware of the predictions. It's not for us to make predictions ourselves. But what we encountered prior to the election campaign starting was a tense political atmosphere, and that continued through the campaign as well. We had observers at a number of rallies and demonstrations that were happening from parties across the country. So we had a good impression of how they were being conducted. We also had a chance to speak to the police, and they informed us of, you know, their own perceptions and impressions of what might happen. And here in Yerevan, in Republic Square, we were able to see firsthand in our core team those rallies, campaign rallies, very close to the election. And a very positive atmosphere around those campaign rallies, I have to say. People giving speeches, talking about why they want to be in government. Supporters there to cheer on the people that they support. So all the things that you'd like to see in a robust and healthy democratic campaign.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much. Thank you.